Audio and time. 2 minutes. You know the other one.
Yeah.
32 seconds. Everyone sit down, please. We have 28 seconds. Are we going to close the back doors? Can I get a sound check? Test 1, 2, 3.
Why so serious? Melissa, are you going to give us a green light? Good afternoon and welcome to the first ever ENDA Situation Room. We are gathered here at New York Law School in New York City, thanks to the gracious hosting of New York Law School, and we're having you all watch online live, thanks to our hosts, our virtual hosts at Towleroad, and we're grateful to Andy Toll, as well as the Dean of the New York Law School, for bringing us all together for this first of a series of events. And first, let me tell you who we are and why we're here. My name is Tico. I'm the founder and president of an LGBT organization called Freedom to Work. We are the only single-issue specialist in the LGBT movement dedicated exclusively to making workplaces more fair for LGBT Americans and to passing the long-stalled LGBT Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And to call us an organization is in some ways a misnomer. We're more of a campaign. We're here to accomplish that goal, to pass the LGBT Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and then in the words of Liz Lemon of 30 Rock, we want to shut it down. We're here to finish the campaign as quickly as possible and then put ourselves out of jobs. I'm really grateful that you've all tuned in and that folks are here with us at New York Law School. We're coming together at a really critical moment for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and actually at a historic moment. It's been 17 years, almost to the day, since the United States Senate last voted on ENDA. Unfortunately, 17 years ago in September, when they took that first and only ENDA vote, we came short just one vote. Senator Pryor of Arkansas didn't show up, wasn't able to show up, and because of that, we came one vote shy of passing it. We think now, 17 years later, we are poised for a major victory. We're not just going to get to 50 votes. We're not just going to get to 60 votes. We are going to run up the score because Americans now agree, no matter your party, no matter your political affiliation, there is an overwhelming consensus and a supermajority of Americans who believe that everybody deserves a fair shot to build a career, to hold a job based on your talents, based on your hard work, and not based on irrelevant things like who you are or who you love. So we're very excited that this fall, Senate leaders have promised that there will be a Senate vote finally after 17 years. We're going to win that vote, and today's talk, today's Situation Room, is about, in a very transparent way, talking to the LGBT community, talking to reporters, and talking about the strategies that we're going to use to win. So we've got a collection of experts who are going to define the problem of LGBT workplace discrimination, explain how it affects people, how it drives down wages, how it means job insecurity if you are transgender, if you are gay, if you are lesbian, if you are bisexual, and how ENDA will fix that, will give people a fair shot to be judged based on talent and hard work. And we're going to tell you how we're going to get there. We're going to talk about the lobbying that needs to be done with a small number of holdout Democrats, and with a bunch of fair-minded Republicans who aren't quite there yet, or at least haven't declared publicly that they're with us, but who actually are with us. And we're going to hear from expert Republican lobbyists about the efforts that we're undertaking to get to a supermajority vote on the Senate on ENDA. So thanks for being with us. I want to turn things over now to a friend of mine, someone with whom I started off my legal career when we were baby lawyers at a New York law firm. Ari Ezra Waldman is a professor of law here at the New York Law School. He is also the legal contributor who you probably read when you check in midweek at Towleroad. He has excellent commentary on campaigns for freedom to marry, on litigation for LGBT civil rights, and he also does excellent coverage of our work. I'm very grateful in particular that Ari covered our historic lawsuit, Freedom to Work versus ExxonMobil. We are working to hold that enormous corporation accountable for its anti-gay, anti-lesbian, anti-trans policies and practices. We've got a historic, groundbreaking lawsuit that we brought forward in Illinois, and I think we're going to win. And it was great that Ari also, in his commentary, said, we're going to win. So I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ari Ezra Waldman.
Thank you, Tico, and it's an honor to be here with this panel and speaking with all of you at home. I will just take a moment before we get into the heart of this discussion just to contextualize and introduce what we're going to discuss here today. We are here quite clearly to discuss how to end employment discrimination. It's a difficult task, but it cannot be more important. In 29 states, you can be fired simply for being gay. And the fact that no one could even imagine these days that it would be so easy to fire someone for being African American or being a woman or being a Catholic like it used to be, that tells us two things. And I want us to talk today in this context of these two lessons that we can learn. First, we know that gays are uniquely victimized by employment discrimination in 2013. This problem feeds an insidious narrative, not only that it's okay to discriminate against members of the LGBT community, but also that because none of us would imagine that it's okay to discriminate against women or against blacks or against Catholics in employment, that there's something different, there's something special, something special in a bad way about sexual orientation and gender expression that somehow justifies this discrimination. And that narrative is something that we need to end. And second, the fact that there is such a difference, such a gulf between discrimination against LGBT individuals in employment and discrimination against Catholics, for example, or women or African Americans in employment, shows us that not only does something need to be done, but something can be done. And that's why we're here. We're here to learn from activists and advocates in the field and from our successful advocates in other areas of how we can win and how we can end employment discrimination with ENDA. So we're going to ask a couple of questions. How can we get ENDA passed in this Congress? What tools do we have to do that, and what tools do we still need? What are the most effective arguments for reaching all the stakeholders and all the parties in this debate? And finally, what can we learn from our allies, and what can we learn from our successful advocates in other areas in which the LGBT community has been so successful over the years? So to that end, I'd now like to introduce our panel members. and to begin this discussion. Joining Tico for the discussion with New York Law School and Towleroad and Freedom to Work, we're honored to welcome Brad Sears, who is the executive director of the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School. Brad is both a friend and a leading expert in LGBT demographics and LGBT research in general. I've referenced his work quite a bit. Next to him, we have Melissa Sklarz, who's the president of the Stonewall Democrats of New York City. Melissa is a longtime activist in Democratic and LGBT politics in general. Next is Gregory Angelo, the executive director of the Log Cabin Republicans. He has been a tireless advocate and lobbyist for increased Republican support for ENDA. Next, we have Kim Taylor, who's a member of the board of Log Cabin, who's, as an elected official from New Jersey, she has been effectively lobbying for Republican support on the ground in New Jersey for these issues. And finally, we have David Montez, who is the acting president of GLAAD, and he has been working to elevate ENDA's profile in the media, along with a whole slew of other issues that ENDA has been working on so successfully over the past few years. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to hand the conversation over to Brad so we can begin our substantive talk.
Great, and thank you for having me here today. I'm the executive director of the Williams Institute, and we do research on LGBT populations. We're part of UCLA School of Law. And so really our role is to do legal and social science research on a variety of LGBT issues, including experiences in the workplace. So I'm just going to briefly summarize our research and research of other scholars really around 3 points. The first is that LGBT people make up an important and very active part of the overall workforce. Second, that a number of different ways of researching and documenting workplace experiences consistently show that LGBT people in the past and today continue to face high rates of employment discrimination. And finally, this discrimination not only negatively impacts the experiences and incomes of LGBT people, but has a negative impact on businesses and the economy as a whole. So as to the first point, we know for those who identify as LGBT, there are about 8 million workers in the United States who identify as LGBT, and from Census Bureau data, we know that the rates of employment are actually higher than employment rates overall for the country. We also know from looking at data throughout the recession that LGBT workers were particularly impacted by the recession and more experienced unemployment during the last 5 years than the national average. In terms of where they work, they're pretty much represented equally as their non-LGBT counterparts in all segments of the economy, with about 1 in 8 LGBT employees being public sector employees, and they're slightly overrepresented in the nonprofit sector. The second point I'd like to make is that a variety of ways that researchers have traditionally looked at discrimination on the basis of race and basis of sex, when they apply the same methodologies to LGBT workers, they consistently show experiences of discrimination. And that research, continuing up, I reviewed a study actually last night, shows that this is not a thing of the past, that the discrimination continues to today. I'm going to briefly look at 3 different areas of research that have traditionally been used to document discrimination and now have been used to document that discrimination against LGBT people. The first is surveys, asking employees what they experience or what they've witnessed in the workplace. The second is an analysis of wages and looking at differentials or gaps in wages. Probably most people are familiar with the gender wage gap, the persistent gap in wages between men and women for similar work. And the third is you can look at administrative complaints and court cases and also get a sense of at least what's going on in the workplace and showing up to the level that people are filing complaints resulting in court opinions. In 2009, the Institute reviewed all the literature at that time that dealt with surveys of LGBT workers and their experience. We found about 80 surveys. All of them consistently showed fairly high rates of discrimination. I'm just going to summarize 2 more recent ones which have the advantage of being recent, and they were based on national random samples. So these are surveys of the U.S. population that were national scope, random, asking people if they're LGBT, and if they identified as LGBT, asking them their experiences with discrimination. The first was actually a module that the Williams Institute put on the GSS in 2008, asking if people identified as LGB and their experiences of discrimination. In that survey, about 1 in 5 reported some form of discrimination. 1 in 3 reported experiences of harassment in the workplace, and almost 1 in 10 reported some form of explicit discrimination in hiring, firing, and promotion. This year, Pew Surveys did another random sample. I asked people to identify as LGBT. 21% of LGBT employees this year reported that they had experienced discrimination at some point in their work lives, and 5% reported that that experience had been in the past year. The second area of research is wage gaps, and when we apply the same analysis that scholars use to look at the gender wage gap, what we find is that there isn't much of a gap that's shown between women in same-sex couples. This is the best data we have to analyze the wage gap as those in same-sex couples, and women in different-sex couples. What this research consistently shows is that there is a wage gap ranging from about 10 to 30% in the wages of gay men and their different-sex counterpart. That is the overall data. When we look at subpopulations within the LGBT community, there are particular groups that are more disadvantaged. These include people who are both people of color and LGBT, transgender workers, women, couples with children, and non-citizens. I'm happy to discuss research with you about these groups further, but they all are particularly vulnerable. And finally, when you look at administrative complaints, such as those filed with state enforcement agencies or the EEOC, per 10,000 workers, there are about 4 to 5 complaints on the basis of race and sex when you look at the number of underlying workers in the workforce. When we've looked at states that have already prohibited sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, we see a similar rate. So LGBT people are an important part of the workforce. Even to today, they continue to face high rates of discrimination, and this discrimination impacts not only themselves, but the businesses that they work for. Thank you.
Hi, I'm happy to be here today. Well, let's see, I am neither an attorney or a policy expert. I'm a political person. So what does that mean? I'm the one that knocks on doors looking for prime voters, and then when they're not home, their immigrant parent answers the door, and within 60 seconds, this non-English speaking person is smiling, nodding, and taking my literature. That's what I do. I'm also transgender. A 90-second history of post-war politics in America. After World War II, America was awash with militarism and consumerism. Democrats and Republicans, when John Boehner and I were children, we took a look at the difference between Democrats and Republicans, and the determination was that Democrats were interested in moving forward. They saw racism, they saw militarism, and they wanted to examine it. In those days, Republicans were sort of interested, but they wanted to move much slower, and they wanted to see what other options were out there. The civil rights struggle of the late 50s and early 60s fractured that even more, and then you had Democrats that wanted to move quickly versus Democrats that wanted to move slowly. You had Republicans that wanted to stay still, and then you had a subsection that wanted to look backwards. Way backwards. Ronald Reagan said the Democrats are wrong. This is a different narrative for the way America is. And then Newt Gingrich said Democrats are evil, and this is the way it should be. And so now we have a whole subsection of people that are interested in politics. We have people that are looking forward, people looking backward, and now we have people that are going, have I told you anything about William McKinley? And these people are a problem. And unfortunately, what used to be a joke when John Boehner and I were children now have a huge voice in American politics today. Where the 20th century doesn't work for America, it's the 19th century. And these are the Tea Party or whatever you want to call them. What I want to be able to do is, people here are the ones that have taught the Democratic Party on how to look forward, look in the future, take risks, and to be the party of equality and justice. And it's what I signed on for long history, generations in my family. And so this is something I believe in. And it's hard to get it right. You know, when you have the concept of policy, you know, good, smart, sound policy, versus politics. So here you are, you're going to take these new ideas, you're going to bring them to the floor, you're going to convince your friends and family, your neighbors that these ideas matter, and then your job depends upon a popularity contest every 4 years. That's very difficult to do. If it was just policy, my colleagues on the panel would be doing all this, but it's not. It's also the popularity contest that goes with it, and that's difficult. You know, I love that I'm here today with Gregory and Kim. Gregory and Kim are not the problem. They are the solution. You know, I take a look at the Republican Party. Don't hit me. I take a look at it as sort of like Frankenstein's monster. Everyone, all their little things, they have a piece. They're going to put the arms and the legs and the chest and all that. But now they're in the operating room and they're fighting to who puts in the brain, you know, and it's a mess. And so you're having different aspects of the Republican Party coming, what is important for America and what is not. And we all stand around and we're in the waiting room watching that. What part of the Republican Party are we going to have to deal with? Is it going to be the part, the soul that hopefully that Kim and Gregory represent, or are we going to have to deal with these 19th century people, or in the case of Scalia, 18th century people that want to go back to then, and which is not a fight for equality and justice. It's a fight, well, they would probably be able to explain a lot better than I would. It's hard to understand. They believe that government has no right in any place in any of our lives. I do not agree with that. You know, I want to be here. I want to convince my friends and family and neighbors that equality and justice is American, and it's helped the communities of color, it's helped women, LGBT, and if we're lucky, someday it may even help transgender people have their place in the marketplace, in the voting booth, as we continue to pay taxes, be part of the fabric of America. So as that battle in the operating room for the brain of the Republican Party goes on, I hope that Gregory and Kim win. I'm glad they have a place in there. I'm happy that the Democrats are moving forward. I know that Tico is concerned that they're moving too slowly, and I'm willing to hang in there and continue to educate them so that they understand that our issues are their issues. It's easy to be a Democrat from New York City as opposed to places like Florida and Arkansas, where what is a Democrat can mean very, very different things. But, you know, we have our people here, and, you know, and we're willing to help them make those decisions, give them data that will understand that their voters, their people, in the popularity contest that is politics, are in fact favor of equality and justice.
Well, thanks, Melissa. I'm happy to be here on the panel with you, and certainly thankful to Tico and to New York School of Law for hosting Melissa and everyone on this panel, and for welcoming Kim and I here today. I didn't come here to litigate the differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I'm someone who is a part of the Republican Party, not because of the party's positions on things like marriage equality, but in spite of those positions. And I'm someone who leads an organization that was founded specifically because we wanted to support a gentleman by the name of Ronald Reagan who opposed, at tremendous political risk, the Briggs Initiative, which would have made it illegal for public school teachers in California to be out in the workplace. It's interesting that it was the potential for that employment non-discrimination that helped to found log cabin Republicans, and it's a tradition that I'm happy to continue as the executive director of this organization right now. Employment non-discrimination protections are something that log cabin Republicans has long advocated for, and I'm working right now with Tico, with Christian Burley at Freedom to Work, and with Kim, and with our entire board of directors to work to make sure that we have Republican support for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act when it comes to the floor of the United States Senate. If Harry Reid is to be believed, then a vote is actually going to happen this fall. And so I'm sure the big question that a lot of people have who are watching this panel today is, how are we going to do it? How are we going to get the Republicans to put this vote over the top when the Democrats have not mustered a sufficient threshold in order to do that unilaterally? And I'm happy to say that we have been engaging with Republicans across the board on employment non-discrimination and other issues, marriage equality. We're not just single issue voters and log cabin Republicans, but we're certainly push equality issues for members of the gay and lesbian community. And specifically, the version of ENDA right now that is coming out of the United States, that just came out of the committee, the Help Committee in the United States Senate. So let's talk names, right? Let's talk actual targets. It's not really much of a secret which Republicans in the United States Senate, log cabin Republicans, is engaging with, and that other grassroots advocacy organizations such as Freedom to Work are engaging with. And there's really potential for some movement there for some, and then there are thoughtful discussions happening right now among Republicans and senior staff to get Republicans to a place where they're comfortable enough to vote for this bill. So specifically, certainly Senator Rob Portman is someone who we're looking at, that we're consistently engaging with his office. The fact that he has come out in support of marriage equality certainly makes him a natural person to be having discussions with in the United States Senate. The fact that he has a gay son who could be specifically targeted for employment discrimination himself puts a very personal face on this, much as the marriage equality debate became very personal for Senator Portman because of his gay son. It's the Employment Non-Discrimination Act is something that strikes home personally to him as well. So we're engaging with Portman's office, and the fact that Ohio does not have those protections right now is something that, beyond an executive order from Governor Kasich, is something that that could make this an issue that the senator could be movable on. And also the fact that because you have right now three pro-marriage equality Republicans in the United States Senate that are able to put a one-on-one, colleague-to-colleague face on these issues, Senator Portman can be there to talk about marriage equality and things like the Employment Non-Discrimination Act with colleagues such as Senator Flake from Arizona. He's also someone that we're working with, that we're engaging with. This is of course, while Senator Flake was a congressman, he voted for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act in 2007, and the fact that he is on record as voting for Employment Non-Discrimination Act makes him another Republican who could be a potential supporter for ENDA. In addition to Senator Portman and Senator Flake, there are a number of other Republicans that we're engaging with, and the fact is we leave no stone unturned in log cabin Republicans. There have been surprises in the past with votes, senators, congressmen, even on the local level. I was chairman of log cabin Republicans of New York State when marriage equality passed for the first and to date only time in a Republican-controlled legislature. So I'm someone who knows firsthand not to leave any stone unturned. So in addition to Senator Portman, Senator Flake, we're additionally looking at Senators Heller from Nevada, Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania, and Senator Ayotte from New Hampshire. These are senators who, in addition to being potential targets, have all gone on record, including Senators Portman and Flake, as voting for the Violence Against Women Act in the United States Senate. This is a bill that included protections specifically for LGBT individuals. The entire acronym was in there, right? So it was sexual orientation, gender identity was a part of the Violence Against Women Act that passed with overwhelming support, Republican support in the United States Senate. And so there's certainly the fact that gay and lesbian protections existed in that bill does not make, in our perspective, LGBT protections a poison pill for those senators. So we're engaging with all those offices, and I can tell you that there are thoughtful discussions that are happening in all 5 of those senators' offices. And what we're looking for is to make sure that when this ultimately comes up for a vote in the United States Senate, that it's not just passage by a 60-vote threshold, that it's not just 1 or 2 votes, but that we have a really strong show of Republican support for this bill. We're working to make that happen. We're working to address any concerns that Republicans have about the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and continuing those discussions in hope of ultimate passage. I know that these things can happen. It can be a challenge. I often tell people that my job as head of log cabin Republicans is often the most frustrating, at times the most thrilling job that you can have in Washington, D.C. And it's those thrilling moments, such as Senator Orrin Hatch, Senator Lisa Murkowski joining Senator Mark Kirk in voting for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act out of the Health Committee, that keep me going and give me hope that the Republican Party will return to its roots of equality and the principles that founded log cabin Republicans.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank Tico for having me here today, and also the New York Law School for hosting us. It is an honor to be here today. First, I want to start off by saying I am not a politician. I'm political, but I am not a politician. A politician is someone who would vote no when they know they should be voting yes. And that is not me. When they see an injustice being done and they still vote no, that is not me. So I want to say today, I am not a politician. The right to work is fundamental to human existence. We have a right to be protected. I, as an openly gay woman, have a right to be protected in the workplace. I have a right to know that when I apply for a job, the only thing that you will use to determine my qualification or not to be qualified will be my education, my work experience, the things that everyone else is being looked at upon for, not because of my sexual orientation. It is important that we move forward. In New Jersey, we were the 5th to realize that our law against discrimination was not complete. So in 1992, Governor Florio signed an amendment to protect the LGBT community and to say to those in New Jersey and those outside of New Jersey, it is not done yet. The work still must continue. Don't rest at just the little bit, covering the few, because there are more than just a few who need your protection. We understand that in New Jersey, our work is hard. The road is long. You will not make friends when it comes time to doing what is right, but it's what is right that must be done. Maintaining one's viability as a self-sustaining worker is important. One needs to know that he or she will be free from bias, discrimination, harassment, and bullying in the workplace. Based on who they are and whom they love are not a reason to be discriminated against. There is never a good reason to be discriminated against, and we must come to that understanding. Human existence is being stifled right now, and we cannot exist that way when one's employment options are restricted and human dignity is choked. I'm asking those on the Hill to not stifle me any longer, to allow me to seek employment wherever I may choose, to not be afraid of losing votes because you are doing what is right. I'm not asking for a gay right. I'm asking for a human right, as we are all humans and we are all entitled to respect, dignity, and protection. Thank you.
That's a tough one to follow. Thank you. GLAAD is honored to be here on this panel with so many distinguished speakers. Thank you, Tico, for including us, and thank you to the New York School of Law for hosting us, and also thank you to Towleroad for being our virtual hosts. So GLAAD is an organization, a media organization, that harnesses the power of the media to tell our stories. And so I think it's only fitting that I start with a story. And this is a story about Brian Martin, who lives in Atlanta, Georgia, and has spent the last 20 years working in the telecommunications field. He was hired at a software company and was successful at his work. And he was also the subject to several derogatory comments about his sexual orientation, his age, and his race by his supervisor. The more successful Brian was, the more inappropriate his supervisor got. He was told that he should flame out, or he should wear a tutu to an executive lunch. He was also told that as the highest ranking African American in the company, he should be flattered. When Brian distanced himself from his supervisor over the comments, his performance rating, which had been stellar up to that point, was under attack, and eventually he was terminated. So why do I tell this story? So before I put this presentation together, I'd never heard of Brian Martin, and I do this work for a living. There are so many people in the American public who believe that workplace protections already exist for LGBT workers. So they don't see the need for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Statistics also show that the vast majority of the American public already thinks that LGBT people should be protected. So GLAAD's work in this campaign is to change the culture so that people understand that ENDA is needed. So how do we do that? As the LGBT movement's media arm, we are developing creative campaigns to educate people about the fact that you can legally be fired just for being who you are. We will harness the power of social media, traditional media, and Spanish language media as well to amplify the voices of LGBT people who have experienced workplace discrimination. To do this, we will train storytellers to tell their stories and make them visible on local, national, and Spanish language news media. By sharing the stories of people who have been harassed or fired, we are able to raise public awareness about why a fully inclusive ENDA is so important. The movement is already highlighting and profiling the stories of people who have been harassed or fired for being LGBT through various organizations, websites, and through some smaller campaigns. But we need more diverse stories, and transgender people, and especially LGBT people of color, who are often overlooked, but as Brad mentioned, often face the most discrimination. So I mentioned Spanish language and Latino media before. This is really important for this campaign and also for GLAAD for two reasons. One is that the Latino population is growing immensely in this country and very quickly. It was very influential in the 2012 elections and will be influential going forward. The second that most people don't know is that Spanish language media is quickly outpacing English language media. Univision now beats the three major English language networks in primetime ratings. As Gregory mentioned, the three states in particular that we're targeting for Republican support, Florida, Arizona, and Nevada, have large Latino populations. Latinos represent 15% of registered voters in Nevada, 14% in Florida, and the Latino population is just under 2 million and represents 30% of the state's population in Arizona. GLAAD is the only organization within the movement that has a dedicated Spanish language media team, and we will deploy that team to help educate people in those states about why the Employment Non-Discrimination Act is important. So, the power of the media, plus powerful stories, plus GLAAD's work to prepare storytellers and our work with the media to tell these stories equals the American public understanding the need for a fully inclusive Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's been joining us. I want to thank the members of the panel. We've started on a very interesting and a very difficult discussion. I was checking the Freedom to Work Twitter feed to see if anyone had asked questions. Several people have. But the first question that comes to mind to me that I would like to pose to the panel before we get to everyone else, that's my privilege as the moderator, is one that was actually captured by a commentator on Towleroad the other day. And I'll just read his comment, which starts at, or his or her comment. Does anyone actually believe that this will go anywhere at all anytime soon with this particular Congress? Sure, it's always good to have a conversation to keep the issue at the forefront, but this is DOA, and giving false hope is cruel. And Gregory, when you when you spoke about the importance of reaching out to Republican senators and Republican congressmen, we all know that that's important. However, you did mention and acceded to the fact that we have to reach 60 or more. We want to reach more than that. We have to reach 60 or more because there are Republicans who are going to filibuster, and we need Republican support because it's going to be incredibly hard to get this passed in a Republican-controlled Congress. So is this commentator correct that with the House in control of the Republicans and Republican senators willing to filibuster it, that ENDA is DOA?
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, you know, when people tell me that ENDA is DOA, even if it does get out of the Senate, it's going to die in the House, I remind people that this Congress, for the first time in history, a GOP-controlled House passed legislation that included LGBT protections. That was the Violence Against Women Act. The reason that bill came to the, and by the way, House leadership brought that bill to the floor of the United States Senate, knowing that the House version of the bill, which did not include those protections, would fail, and let their members vote their conscience. And not only did the bill come to the floor with LGBT protections, but 87 Republican members of Congress voted for that bill. Clearly, LGBT protections are not a poison pill for those 87 Republicans. So there's potential there, right? I mean, I'm not going to shut the door on these things. As I said, we leave no stone unturned at log cabin Republicans, and I am not going to. I would not be pursuing ENDA and lobbying for it on the Senate side if I didn't think there was a potential path to victory on the House side. So it's defeatism to think that this would never come up for a vote. The fact also that there's grassroots organizing going on right now such that would and should this bill come to the floor, again, you're trusting Harry Reid to bring it to the floor, but would and should the bill come to the floor of the Senate and pass the Senate, there would be a huge push of grassroots support among constituents of Republican members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress to actually bring this to the floor. So there's definitely potential there, and we're lobbying as though this is going to come to the floor of the House just as much as we're lobbying that's going to come to the floor of the Senate. We're making sure Republicans in Congress are as aware of ENDA as they are in the Senate.
Tico, are you as optimistic as Gregory?
I agree with Gregory that you can only win if you're willing to try. And one of the mistakes that our movement has made on ENDA in prior years is that we simply didn't try. We conceded, we waved the white flag before we even had the congressional battles. You know, a year ago, Freedom to Work sent a letter to Harry Reid and said, you've now been majority leader of the Senate for, at that point, 5 years, and you haven't brought ENDA to a vote. It's time. And no other national organization joined us in calling out Harry Reid on that. This year, we have been joined. Our leadership has been met by other national organizations who are now calling on Harry Reid. So we almost had to lobby other LGBT groups as in addition to lobbying the Congress. So now the good news is there is a uniform consensus among the major LGBT organizations that this is a year where we can and we will rack up a huge Senate victory. But then on the next step, there isn't conformity just yet. I sense that some LGBT leaders want to declare victory with a Senate win and go home and leave all of 2014, which is the second part of this congressional session, and not make an effort, not launch a robust House campaign. And it is true that it will be an uphill campaign. It is true that I wouldn't bet a whole lot of money that we're gonna win it, but we've got to try. And one of the things we do by trying is we increase our political power. We, by using our muscles, make them stronger. We campaign, we do public education by campaigning. You know, the most depressing ENDA statistic is that 90% of Americans mistakenly believe it's already law. Congress, this is a do-nothing Congress on both sides. This is a do-nothing Congress. And it's amazing that the American people on this issue give Congress too much credit. They believe Congress has done the right thing when Congress has not done it.
Amazing.
So I think that huge Senate victory will do a lot of public education because this will be a front page story on papers across the country. It'll lead the nightly news that finally Congress has passed this long-stalled basic civil rights bill for LGBT people. And we should ride that momentum.
Yeah.
My take is the day after we win a Senate vote, literally the day after, we'd like our friends in the House of Representatives to start a discharge petition. That's a procedure in the House that allows you to get a bill out of committee where it's stuck and take it directly to the floor. So you take control of the House of Representatives by getting 218 members of Congress to sign that discharge petition. It has worked recently, for example, in the McCain-Feingold legislation, which passed because those folks on a bipartisan basis were able to sign the discharge petition. It's worked in popular culture. If you've watched Legally Blonde 2, Reese Witherspoon used the discharge petition to get Bruiser's bill out of that committee to the Senate floor. Bruiser was protected. You know, Bruiser was a gay dog, and so gay rights has been advanced once in the movies, and I think it's time to try it in real life. The discharge petition isn't the only option, but it's one of several options that we should use. We should not give up. We should push into the House.
Taking control of the House of Representatives, I think Speaker Boehner should hire you. He needs help in that area as well. Before we continue on with my questions, I wonder if we have any questions from the press. Chris at the Blade. Chris Johnson, please.
Hi, I'm Chris Johnson with the Washington Blade, as Ari just said. My question is, how much of the advocacy toward ENDA should be placed towards initiating a vote as opposed to getting more support for the bill? Is it more of a problem of getting more votes at this point and for successful passage, or is it more of an issue of getting Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate to get this bill on the floor to get the process started? Where should we be working here?
I'll start with that. I believe we're ready for the ENDA vote in the Senate today. I believe if the vote were taken, we would cross today the 60-vote threshold. It's not going to happen today. There's a lot of stuff going on in Congress, and we understand that, and we're realistic. But we do believe that the ENDA vote should happen as soon as possible, and then when it happens, we will win. From today until the day that Senator Reid finally does call the vote, which might be October or November, we will work hard. We will lobby. We will elevate the issue in the media and with the American public. We'll do everything we can to rack up as big of a vote as possible, but our position is sooner is better. Let's take the vote right away.
I want to follow up on Chris's insightful question. We had a lot of talk on the panel about the fact that the argument needs to be made. I'd like to dive a little bit deeper and discuss what kind of arguments need to be made and to whom. So, Brad, maybe you can help me. You have the benefit of quantitative data, and you know who the different stakeholders are and who the different parties are and what moves them. What kind of arguments do you think we need to make based on the data that you know in order to get, say, conservative businessmen on our side, or the wealthy leaders of large corporations in the United States to come out in support of ENDA, much like they came out in support of marriage equality?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think part of the answer is, like the American public, that the corporate leaders are already there. I mean, I think this is a great example of where corporate America, particularly big corporate America, has moved ahead of Congress, has moved ahead of a lot of state and local governments in adopting these policies without the requirement of having to. So, you know, I think in terms of sexual orientation, it's 90% plus. In terms of the top 50 largest companies in this country having a sexual orientation prohibition of discrimination, and it's 70% plus on gender identity. So companies are doing this, and we did a study about why are they doing this. They're doing it because it fits with their corporate values of a respectful, open workplace. They're also doing it because it makes good business sense, and the reasons that they cite is it makes employees more productive, and academic research supports that employees, if they can be out and bring their entire self to the workplace, they're more productive, they're more loyal, they have less absenteeism, they have less health issues, they're less likely to be looking for another job. So that type of workplace makes employees happier and more productive. It's also a way to recruit and retain the best employees. It fits into a broader benefit of diversity by having a group of people with different experiences who can tackle problems and approach them in different ways. And, you know, it obviously helps to have LGBT employees to serve a diverse customer base. So companies get this. That's why they're doing it. The academic research backs up these benefits. I think they get it, and just like they get the same sort of economic benefits from having their employees be happy and who they are in their entire lives, public and private, and therefore have supported marriage, they're ready and are jumping on board with supportive ENDA.
Greg and Kim, I'm going to give direct the same similar question to you. What kinds of arguments specifically do we have to make, or do you think we should be making to bring Republican representatives and Republican senators on board? Gregory, you mentioned earlier, and specifically highlighting the case of Senator Portman from Ohio, who may be a good focal point because he has a gay son. And that gay son may want to marry and may experience employment discrimination in the future. But I don't want people to leave this panel discussion thinking that personal appeals to those that direct members of your family are the only options for Republican senators. What other kinds of arguments should we make, or do you think will be the most effective to win Republican support?
Yeah. Well, right now, there is a really strong movement in the Republican Party to protect religious liberty. And there are some in the Republican Party who feel that individual liberty, religious liberty, is a zero-sum game, right? We're making the argument for things like marriage equality, for things like the Employment Non-Discrimination Act from an individual liberty standpoint. As Kim so eloquently said, she should be able to apply for a job wherever she chooses, and work that you do should be your hiring, your firing, your promotion should be based on the quality of work that you do, not who you are or who you love. But but there are hesitations among some Republicans about religious liberties. And what I point out is that when it comes to the marriage equality debate in states right now that have it, it was always Republicans who were there providing amendments, making sure that no faith organization or church or house of worship would be forced to solemnize any same-sex marriage. There were also, those amendments that put Republicans who did vote in favor of marriage equality legislation at a point where they were comfortable voting for it. So much like our lobbying for marriage equality in that regard, we're pushing Employment Non-Discrimination Act support in that same regard, where if you care about religious liberty and you care about individual liberty, you need to support the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And it was also, incidentally, those really strong religious protections that exist in the Senate bill that passed out of committee that got Republicans who did support it in committee, people like Senator Orrin Hatch as a prime example, to that point where they were comfortable supporting that bill because they felt that religious liberty was protected. So taking that mantle of religious liberty, owning it as gay Republican advocates, is something that's working for us. It's a message that's resonating among Republicans on the Hill. I don't know, Kim, if you want to add to that or talk
Well,
about
I just
New Jersey.
want to add to that, one thing, just like anyone, but Republicans, they always talk about money. If these people are not able to work, then where are they going to go? Who's going to support them? And that question comes back on those who do. And that's going to come back on the federal government, giving them money to be able to live. So I think when you're looking at trying to get to the Republican Party, there are basically two ways. I mean, you say about the personal story, but the personal story is how you put a face on an issue. It is how it overturned DOMA, how it passed marriage equality. You have to make it personal. And for a lot of Republicans, they don't think that these arguments are personal. And to go there, you have to say, this could be your son. This could be your neighbor. It is your son. It is your neighbor. And then when all else fails, you say, well, let me show you the bottom line. How much saying no is going to cost you and cost the American people?
I think that's an insightful answer because I think that brings together different wings of a currently fractured Republican Party and hopefully bring a lot of people on board. But the final point you made, making it a personal story, before we get on to questions from the audience and questions from Twitter, maybe, David, maybe you can talk a little bit about how GLAAD is helping us make these stories into personal stories, because you're the media people. How can we rely on you, and what kind of work are you doing to make Kim's and Gregory's job a little easier?
Sure. The most recent example of how we were able to do this is the Boy Scouts campaign. So, in the recent past, there weren't a lot of people talking about the discriminatory practices of the Boy Scouts. GLAAD was approached by Jen Terrell, a scout mother, a den mother from Ohio, who had been kicked out of her Boy Scouts troop for being who she is. She was denied the opportunity to be involved in her son's life. And GLAAD took that story and elevated it into a national campaign. So you couldn't turn on the television or to a news channel for several days without seeing Jen Terrell on there telling her story about being kicked out of the Boy Scouts. And so that's what we do. We take those stories, we train those people to tell them, we elevate their national presence, and then we also pitch them to the media. We give the media the package story with the statistics, with carefully, with true statistics about the reality that exists, and the media takes that story and then elevates it to a bigger level. So that's what we intend to do with the stories of LGBT people who've experienced workplace discrimination.
Sounds like there's great potential for partnerships with the people on this committee, with Brad, with data, David's ability to make the media case, and then we have our Democrats and Republicans who can bring it to the people who are going to make the votes. Before we go on to our Twitter questions, are there any questions in the audience? Yeah, we can go to our microphones on the side. Just say who you are.
Hey, I'm Art Leonard. I'm on the faculty here at New York Law School. I write about new court decisions on gay rights for Gay City News, and I do a newsletter on lesbian and gay law. One thing that has been happening over the past few years, a little bit under the radar of the consciousness of the public is the degree to which gender identity discrimination is becoming covered under Title VII through interpretations, through administrative interpretations and court decisions. And I'm wondering to what extent those developments might be helpful in persuading people to support the now comprehensive version of ENDA. In 2007, Barney Frank thought that having gender identity in ENDA was a game stopper, and as the chief sponsor, he pulled it out, and ENDA without gender identity passed the House. But since then, there's been consensus among all the people who are supporting the legislation that gender identity should be in there. It should be actually in statutory law and not just depending on interpretations. But now that we've got the EEOC formal opinion, the Justice Department appellate body formal opinion, several circuit courts of appeals, increasing number of federal district courts, could this be used to help persuade members of Congress who might have particular problems with gender identity that in fact it's not going to really change things too much to include gender identity in ENDA because it's already being more expansively covered under Title VII?
Good question. Tico, I think maybe you can.
I think Professor Leonard's question is right on. It is important, first of all, for us to highlight that historic Macy versus Holder opinion of the EEOC from about 15 or 16 months ago. It was, according to a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Dana Beyer of Gender Rights Maryland, who's also on our board, the most important transgender legal victory in the history of this country. And it is having ripple effects, you know, not just in the blue states where there are trans protections, but across the country. People are winning cases. People are able to go to the EEOC to file a complaint if they've been harassed at work because they're transgender, if they've been fired at work because they're transgender. And based on existing law in the Civil Rights Act, they're able to win those cases. And that, I think, is, it's an incredibly important legal victory that we should all celebrate and that we should promote so that trans people across the country know that if something happens to you at work, if you're getting harassed or if you get fired, go to the EEOC now. They will take your complaint, they will investigate it, and they will take it very seriously. As to the politics of it, you are also exactly right that this helps us with the still undecided senators and still undecided members of the House. Because what we can say to them, and this is what Freedom to Work says to them when we lobby, I know that it's what other lobbyists say as well, is this is not a big deal. In fact, it's already law. This is just clarifying and making a uniform policy just in case some court somewhere gets it wrong. The other thing that we point out about the Macy versus Holder decision is that it was unanimous, and it was Democrats and Republican commissioners alike all voting for it. These were Republican-appointed commissioners who are Republican appointees. They are there. Oftentimes, some of these very conservative commissioners vote against workers' rights on various issues. But transgender protections have become, I think, a very common sense and bipartisan issue that regardless of party people can support. And that is hugely helpful to tout that Macy versus Holder historic decision when we lobby for ENDA, a fully inclusive ENDA.
Before we get on to the next question, Professor Leonard brings up a good point about what happened last time when ENDA was pulled because of the issue of gender expression, including gender expression protection, as opposed to just sexual orientation protections. Would we now, in 2013, if the bill that is brought before the Senate includes only sexual orientation protections, not gender expression protections, are we going to, are we as a movement going to not accept that and only accept the full, the full ENDA that protects both sexual orientation, gender expression, et cetera? We go down maybe the line and see if we agree on all of that, that we should not accept anything but the whole pie?
We've got to protect our entire community. I think 2007 was a disaster, but the slight silver lining is that we've learned the lessons of 2007. I don't think there's any chance that mistake will be made again. I'm very confident that we will get a full bill that protects all LGBT Americans and we'll settle for nothing less.
Any disagreement on the panel?
No, none here. GLAAD will absolutely not support an Employment Non-Discrimination Act that isn't fully inclusive. And I want to add, too, that we're talking here about ENDA, but legal protection is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's a difference between having a non-discrimination law and being able to put a picture of your partner on your desk. And so I think that that without a fully inclusive ENDA, we also lose the opportunity to tell the stories of trans people who are being discriminated against. That's the only way that we're going to get the culture change that is really what we're after here with the legal change.
Absolutely. More questions? Yes.
Yes, hi, I'm Babs Kaspar-Sipperstein. I'm Director of Grange Gender Rights Advocacy Association of New Jersey. My nonpartisan. I'm also a DNC member, partisan. I want to thank Professor Leonard. I have to rephrase and reframe my question, but before I start with the question, I just wanted to clarify a point. As far as New Jersey, yes, the law against discrimination was amended in 1992, but that was only for LGBT people.
Community, yes, I'm sorry.
In December of 2006, Governor Corzine signed an amendment to the law including gender identity or expression. So I just wanted to make that point. I'm from Jersey. As Professor Leonard had mentioned, as far as, you know, the big, if you pardon the expression, big elephant of the room with the employment rights and LGBT rights is the T, the transgender part. You certainly brought the point about 2007, and you also mentioned the EEOC decision, which theoretically gives us the rights, the legal rights. But in leading the amendment of the law against discrimination, starting back in 2003, I was told, no, you're already protected by the law against discrimination because of a court decision that nobody didn't know. I really wasn't happy until I saw it in black and white. And the EEOC decision, as you had mentioned, should be a very strong selling point. But my question to you, the panel and the people here at Freedom to Work is there are 17 states that do have protections for transgender people. Have you learned, have you gone to those people where it's successful? Have you learned from the states where things have been done rather than the failures?
Melissa, can you
Thank
help
you.
us with that, perhaps?
Thank you. It's very funny, you know, all of us here are talking about these ideas if these are brand new and radical. None are brand new and radical. There is nothing that's been said here today that is new, unique, unusual. It is all now law. It's happening from coast to coast. I've heard my friends from Log Cabin make these talking points, and these are not policy issues, these are political issues. All these terrible things, I mean, we've seen it with marriage, we've seen it with don't ask, don't tell, that all these terrible things that are supposed to happen when LGBT people get rights, none of it is happening. Transgender people have rights in 17 states. We've seen it in the workplace, HRC Corporate Equality Index. Corporate America realized discrimination is bad for business. Of course, they don't have to get elected to their slots. The idea that all of us shouldn't have rights, a small minority is holding us back at the legislative level either. I mean, if you're going to be a computer scientist and you're going to graduate from Duke, are you going to stay with the reactionary laws of North Carolina, or are you going to go to California where you get to be treated, you and your family and friends get to be treated like a human being? The time for these ideas to be new and different, that has left the station. It's the idea that a majority of people are coming together. They have come together. And to figure out a way to prevent a minority of reactionary people to stop holding us back and let us move forward together as a community. The idea that trans people are not going to be included is a 20th century idea. And at the federal level, at the executive level, at the judicial level, it's already happening. They're inventing reasons not to include us on all of these ideas. They're making it up as they go along. And certainly, as people for LGBT rights, enough is enough.
And I'll just add to that, which I think this is part of the value of the Macy decision as well, is that a lot of what the Williams Institute responds to are kind of assertions and myths about LGBT people and policies. And what we have is many years of experience covering tens of millions of people who are already protected by sexual orientation and gender identity protections. And the problems that are articulated still by members of Congress just have not come to pass. People are not confused by the laws. They're not frivolous claims. There are not, people figure out how to go to the bathroom. Like, all of these things are now covering tens of millions of people, and we're not seeing these problems. So I think both Macy and the state and local ordinances and corporate policies have built a great source of empirical knowledge about what happens when you pass these protections.
Another question.
Yeah. I'm Paul Schindler from Gay City News. Gregory, you talked about the concern about religious liberty,
Sure.
and it has struck me in some of the discussions in some legislatures and other public forums that this religious liberty question becomes somewhat disingenuous, somewhat of an excuse, as Melissa said, sort of making it up as you go along. That doesn't change the political reality of having to address it, but I do sometimes have concerns. People bring up the most preposterous examples of something that could go wrong. But there was a letter that went out in April from ACLU, Lambda, NCLR, and the Transgender Law Center, raising concerns about the religious exemption language in the current version of ENDA. The primary concern being that it might set up the same kind of discussion that President Obama had in terms of contraceptive availability in health insurance. Mm-hmm. In other words, would a Catholic hospital, for example, be covered by the religious exemption or not? I think typically public accommodation law would suggest that a Catholic hospital should have to follow non-discrimination law in a different way than a Catholic church would have to follow it when hiring their new priest. So my question to the panel is, are you all comfortable that that language is as clear as it should be and provides as expansive of protections and is really up to snuff with other public accommodation law?
I mean, I'll start just because you mentioned me. It's good to see you, Paul.
Yep.
All right. I am definitely, organizationally, Log Cabin Republicans is comfortable with the language as it exists right now. I can tell you that, without naming names, there are meetings that I have had with Republicans both in the House and in the Senate where there are some Republicans who feel those religious protections don't go far enough. And we're pushing back against that. I think that the protections as they exist now are strong, they're solid, if you open up, it would only be if you broaden those protections that you start getting into ambiguous territory. So yes, organizationally we're fine with those religious protections as they exist. And as I mentioned, it is those religious exemptions as they exist right now in the Senate bill that are a great talking point, a chip that we have with in our negotiations with Republicans in the Senate in order to get support. Correct.
Yeah.
Right. Making sure those protections are there is something that is paramount to them.
Anyone else?
We Freedom to Work agrees with the Log Cabin Republicans, with a handful of other national LGBT groups, that the current ENDA religious exemption is sort of the sweet spot of both law and politics. I should fully disclose that I am one of two authors of the current religious exemption. When I was ENDA's chief counsel in the House of Representatives from 2007 to 2010, along with one other committee counsel, I wrote the current version, which was added into ENDA by an amendment offered by George Miller of California, a very, very, very progressive member of Congress who is really on Team Pelosi and is one of her biggest backers. And the interesting thing about that vote that we held in 2007, specifically on the religious exemption, which stripped out the ACLU version and included this new bipartisan version, is that we racked up 402 votes in Congress. And I've written a few things that have become law and a few things that have been approved by the House of Representatives during my 3 years as a committee counsel. We never, on anything else that I wrote, crossed the 400 vote threshold. That is absolutely huge. And what's amazing is that you had all of our progressive champions. You had Nancy Pelosi, John Conyers, Barney Frank, Tammy Baldwin, who's currently one of our best senators, all voting for that religious exemption, which is the same one as now. And on the other side, you had John Boehner, Eric Cantor, Paul Ryan. You had all of Republican leadership. So this religious exemption has a lot of advantages over the ACLU proposal. One of them is that it is incredibly politically popular, but that's not the reason. That's not the only reason I support it. I think it is the best of all of the options because it provides clarity. It creates a 100% match with the entities that are exempt from Title VII's religious discrimination prohibitions. So we have 40 years of case law, we have 40 years of precedent, we have 40 years of experience that will let religious employers know whether or not they are covered by ENDA. And using that 100% match, tying the ENDA religious exemption explicitly and directly to the Title VII one, provides a lot of clarity for courts and clarity for employers. That is really good. The other thing I'd say, and I am glad that this conversation is happening. I respect the organizations that you listed tremendously. Lambda Legal has been our co-counsel in a very successful transgender case that we litigated over the course of 2 years and won very recently. So I respect them as incredibly good LGBT advocates and very important progressive voices. So I'm glad they're raising these issues. I would challenge the organizations who signed that letter to make public their alternative, and they've not done it.
So, to be clear, a Catholic hospital, a Mormon bookstore, could they fire me?
The answer, as it was in law school, is it depends. It depends on the facts. Law has very few bright line tests, and neither the Title VII religious exemption nor the ENDA religious exemption lists actual types of organizations. So courts have created factors that are considered. One is a for-profit versus non-profit distinction. So if you are for-profit, you are not going to qualify for the religious exemption because you are part of the marketplace. You are there not to promote faith. You are there to promote profit. And so, there's very strong case law that I agree with where for-profit manufacturing companies, for example, tried to claim they were a religious manufacturing company. And they failed miserably in trying to make that claim. The court said, you're here to raise your profits. You're not here to promote your religion. And so we will not allow, and the ENDA religious exemption does not allow people to make false claims of religious status for the purpose of discriminating against people. It is the clearest cut cases are that the Catholic Church will be able to make its own hiring and firing decisions based on Catholic doctrine. I happen to be Catholic, and I disagree with my church's doctrine on these issues, but the church will have a legal right to continue making the hiring decisions that it wants. Catholic Charities, one step removed, a nonprofit, will continue to be able to make hiring and firing decisions based on Catholic doctrine. The same is true of the Mormon Church. The same is true of Baptist Church. The same is true of synagogues and mosques. So we will give houses of worship and religiously affiliated nonprofits the ability to make hiring and firing decisions based on their tenets of faith, just as they can currently do under Title VII based on religious hiring. So a religious nonprofit that is Jewish you can't have an orientation if you're in mission, can only hire Jewish employees, and I think that's appropriate. I don't mean to filibuster, and I know that Melissa wants to go on. So there is unfortunately no clear-cut answer to every single fact pattern, but the good news is we have 40 years of case law under Title VII, and by doing the 100% match, by tying the ENDA religious exemption explicitly to the Title VII religious exemption, that gives us the most clarity, and as a byproduct, and this, for me, it is just a byproduct, it's also the one that's going to help us win. Orrin Hatch voted for ENDA in committee specifically because of the exemption. He has said publicly, if it changes even a little bit, he switches back to no.
Right, but
Melissa, I'll give you the final.
Thank you.
Final quick word on
Thank you,
this.
Counselor, for your explanation. As a LGBT activist, I got tremendous calves from jumping through all the hoops that have been presented in the March for LGBT Equality. This is the latest idea that has been put up as a barrier. And so we have our friends in Log Cabin and Freedom to Work. Well, let's try to make this happen. In the end, they still won't buy it. They won't go for it. They will lose in court. This idea of religious exemption will not stand up in court. You know, it is just a barrier to try to win allies. It's a good idea. We've watched them fight LGBT equality in Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and we've watched it in marriage. And as they keep throwing things at ideas that prevent equality, they will not stand up. If this is going to win allies among the moderate and the right wing so that we can get it to the floor, then great. You know, do I think it'll stand up in court? A generation from now, they will look back at this conversation and shake their heads in wonder.
Thank you, Melissa.
Can I ask
Unfortunately,
just one follow-up to
perhaps-
Tico on that?
Perhaps you can talk to Tico
Gotcha.
after the panel. I think that would be more
I'd be
productive.
happy to keep answering questions on the record.
Unfortunately,
after
our time is up. We have an exciting second panel coming up. I think the take-home lesson of this discussion is that there are great opportunities for, I hate to use this word, but synergies here on this panel. We bring different skills and different perspectives, and all of these together are going to be necessary to not only change the law, but also to change the narrative that says that discrimination against LGBT employees is somehow okay. I want to thank the members of the panel for coming and talking with us and for providing their perspectives. I want to thank Tico for hosting, and of course, New York Law School and Towleroad Online. I'd like to pass the conversation over to Tico now, who is going to introduce where we go from here over the next hour.
Thanks, Ari, for leading a really productive conversation about the legal issues, the issues of data, and really about how we move forward and start scoring some victories to protect people from job discrimination. We're going to have a transition of panels, and while we do, those of you watching at home through Towleroad are going to see a 3-minute news clip and this fits very well with what Dave of GLAAD said about how we need to elevate personal stories and let Americans meet and see the face of those people who faced workplace discrimination. If you're watching at home, you're about to meet a woman named Sherry Hutchinson of Ohio. Sherry has an MBA, a master's in business. She had a very successful career in the private sector. And about 6 or 7 years ago, she decided she wanted to be a public servant and work for a government agency in Cleveland, Ohio. And she got that job. She showed up the first week. She was thrilled and excited to start. And one of the things she did, like anyone else, like many people, in the first week of work, she brought a framed picture of Diane, who is her life partner, to work, and she put it on her desk. And a day later, one of her colleagues pulled her aside and said, Sherry, I don't think it's a good idea for you to advertise that you're a lesbian. And Sherry said, well, I see lots of framed pictures of family members on everyone's desk, and I feel like I should be able to do the same thing. And besides, Sherry said, our employer has an LGBT non-discrimination policy in writing, so I can't imagine that this would actually be an issue. And one of the unfortunate lessons of what happened to Sherry is that it's not enough. It is very important, and we're glad to have the support of so many leading business leaders who've adopted those policies, and they do provide some reassurance. But it's not enough. The law matters, and legal protections matter. So over the course of the next few years, Sherry started to face harassment. Nasty rumors spread about her because she is lesbian. And as she applied for promotions, she was continually denied, even when the people who got the promotions, the straight people who got the promotions, were far less qualified than she was. The good news is that Sherry found great counsel. Freedom to Work did some legal work on her case in a pro bono capacity, helping out her attorneys. And she won a legal victory that I think is very significant. You're going to meet Sherry and hear about her case through this news clip while we transition panels. But the most important thing about Sherry is that she is one of the best ENDA lobbyists I have ever met. She is the founding member of Freedom to Work's Speakers Bureau, and we have flown her from Ohio to the Congress, to Washington, D.C., where she has met with Rob Portman's staff, one of the gettable Republicans, where she has met with dozens of congressional offices and told her story and let people realize that anti-gay, anti-lesbian, anti-bi, and anti-trans discrimination is not a thing of the past. It happens to this day. It happens in Ohio. It happens across the country, and that's why we need ENDA. She has been an incredibly strong advocate for this bill, and we're thrilled and delighted that she's part of Freedom to Work Speakers Bureau. You're about to meet her now while we transition panels. Thanks very much.
Claims of discrimination at a Cuyahoga County agency have resulted in a landmark federal court ruling and payoff by county officials. As News Channel 5's Ted Cortan reports, the case sets a new precedent for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered employees.
She's a nutball.
Stunning statements.
Did you know she writes for a lesbian porno magazine?
From a former Cuyahoga County employee.
Stay away from the gays.
Describing the sexual orientation prejudice she says she experienced while working for the County Child Support Enforcement Agency.
My work, my education, and experience had never gotten through the prejudice.
Sherry Hutchinson is a lesbian. She left her job last month and last week collected a $100,000 settlement from Cuyahoga County. This after a federal judge ruled that sexual orientation employment bias is prohibited under the 14th Amendment.
County first said that the Constitution doesn't protect Sherry Hutchinson. Federal judge said yes it does. They then said there's no basis for a case. The federal judge says yes there is.
The county wasn't even following its own policies.
Hutchinson discussed her case at a press conference today and how she says despite a master's degree in business, she was passed over for promotion 25 different times. In one case,
she ended up hiring a kid recently out of high school who had a year of experience working at GameStop.
The county's attorneys were essentially arguing that gays and lesbians are not part of the we in We the People.
Also at today's gathering, representatives of the push in Washington to pass legislation outlawing sexual orientation bias in the workplace.
You can be fired in a majority of states in the United States just for being gay.
Sherry Hutchinson says she's joining the Freedom to Work movement as an advocate and guest speaker.
All discrimination is irrational, especially in this economic environment.
On your side in Cleveland, I'm Ted Cortan, News Channel 5.
And ironically, Cuyahoga County has long had a written policy against sexual orientation discrimination. And we spoke with Cuyahoga County Executive Ed Fitzgerald's Chief of Staff, Matt Carroll, today. His only comment, quote, legal sentiment speaks for itself. The county is going to follow its policies, end quote. Claims of discrimination at a Cuyahoga County agency have resulted in a landmark federal court ruling and payoff by county officials. As News Channel 5's Ted Cortan reports, the case sets a new precedent for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered employees.
She's a nutball.
Stunning statements.
Did you know she writes for a lesbian porno magazine?
From a former Cuyahoga County employee.
Stay away from the gays.
Describing the sexual orientation prejudice she says she experienced while working for the County Child Support Enforcement Agency.
My work, my education, and experience had never gotten through the prejudice.
Sherry Hutchinson is a lesbian. She left her job last month and last week collected a $100,000 settlement from Cuyahoga County. This after a federal judge ruled that sexual orientation employment bias is prohibited under the 14th Amendment.
County first said that the Constitution doesn't protect Sherry Hutchinson. Federal judge said yes it does. They then said there's no basis for a case. The federal judge says yes there is.
The county wasn't even following its own policies.
Hutchinson discussed her case at a press conference today and how she says despite a master's degree in business, she was passed over for promotion 25 different times. In one case,
she ended up hiring a kid recently out of high school who had a year of experience working at GameStop.
The county's attorneys were essentially arguing that gays and lesbians are not part of the we in We the People.
Also at today's gathering, representatives of the push in Washington to pass legislation outlawing sexual orientation bias in the workplace.
You can be fired in a majority of states in the United States just for being gay.
Sherry Hutchinson says she's joining the Freedom to Work movement as an advocate and guest speaker.
All discrimination is irrational, especially in this economic environment.
On your side in Cleveland, I'm Ted Cortan, News Channel 5.
And ironically, Cuyahoga County has long had a written policy against sexual orientation discrimination. And we spoke with Cuyahoga County Executive Ed Fitzgerald's Chief of Staff, Matt Carroll, today. His only comment, quote, legal sentiment speaks for itself. The county is going to follow its policies, end quote. Claims of discrimination at a Cuyahoga County agency have resulted in a landmark federal court ruling and payoff by county officials. As News Channel 5's Ted Cortan reports, the case sets a new precedent.
help gratified by what's happening in Hawaii right now, where the governor is just calling a special session of the legislature.
A mere 20 years after we launched this current campaign, we are going to bring the freedom to marry to Hawaii.
Just an eye blink in the span of the universe. So we should all be happy about that. But you were involved in the first case in Hawaii in the early 90s that raised this question of same-sex marriage as a real possibility again, and it's something to be envisioned as real from a grassroots demand for it, from couples in Hawaii who wanted to get married in spite of resistance from every major gay organization that said, no way in hell is this going to happen. And in employment or public accommodations or housing or just general non-discrimination laws, again, the start in '74 in the Congress, not going anywhere, but then sort of bit by bit, state by state, town by town, and now again the big push for ENDA seen as potentially possible because we have had successes on marriage and don't ask, don't tell and others. And we have protections in about the same number of states as we have marriage equality right now, but a sort of equivalence there. So I turn to Evan at this point and say, as these parallel tracks have gone along, what do you see in looking at this that strikes you as lessons to be learned as we launch into yet again an attempt to legalize protections for LGBT people in the workplace?
Well, one of the happy consequences of the momentum we've seen in the Freedom to Marry movement and in our campaign and the successes we've racked up and the sea change that we've inspired in hearts and minds is that we and I are now being asked to talk to other sister movements, the environment, the education movement, education reform, voting rights, death penalty, and their funders and stakeholders all across the country over the last year and a half or so who want to know, how are we doing this? And why are we winning when so much else that we care about
in a progressive vision for our country isn't going where it needs to go? And the very first thing I always want to point out to people is we're not done. We've made tremendous progress. There's been this sea change. We have the momentum. We have the winning strategy. But we have a lot of work left to do. We've won about a third of Americans now living in a marriage state. That leaves 2/3 of Americans who don't yet have the freedom to marry. So this is no time to be complacent or celebratory to the extent of taking our foot off the pedal. Our job at Freedom to Marry, our job as a movement, our job as progressives with a vision of America that's inclusive is to finish the job. And the second point I often make is that, now the Freedom to Marry campaign is being held out as some kind of model. But in fact, for most of it, it's been kind of a muddle. We've had trial and error, we've had stumbles, we've had missed opportunities,
arguments,
arguments, fights, divisions, as has every social justice and civil rights cause in the U.S. and probably around the world. So there are lessons that we can offer that I think we want to apply on other fronts, but it's not like this is somehow perfect or that we're done. But having said that, I think that one of the things that Freedom to Marry and our movement in embracing this campaign, with all the divisions and arguments it took to get there, has to offer is a real ladder of clarity. And what I mean by that is, I think one of the key engines of the Freedom to Marry's relative success as a model for our movement and other movements is we've had this ladder of clarity about how to get the job done, and it begins with the end. It begins with great clarity about what is the goal, what is the vision, and it's put forward. And I took that from the woman who coined the word feminism back in the 1900s, one of the French suffragists named Hubertine Auclair, who said, if you would obtain a right, first you must proclaim it. And the importance of first being able to put forward an inspiring and clear vision of what your goal is, how do you know when you've won, is essential to people's rallying to get it done. They have to believe it's attainable, they have to believe it's urgent, they have to be inspired by it. Working down from the goal, we've had a very clear strategy. I think one of the hallmarks of Freedom to Marry, the campaign, is that people can go on our website and know what the strategy is, what needs to happen in order to make this happen. And in the case of the freedom to marry, the way we're going to win has always been to create a critical mass of states and a critical mass of public support that create the climate for a victory in the Supreme Court. The strategy has never been to win within the four corners of every single state, but on the other hand, you have to win enough states and shift enough public opinion to embolden the justices to do the right thing. And as we all saw with the victory we had in the Supreme Court this year, we got a lot of what we sought, but we didn't get everything we sought because we weren't yet there. We weren't yet there with this critical mass of states and critical mass of public support. So the strategy, what we at Freedom to Marry have called the roadmap to victory on our website, is to get that critical mass of states and critical mass of public support. Working down from clarity of strategy, we've had clarity of what I call vehicles. The pieces of work that need to be achieved, the mini campaigns, the specific legal and political accomplishments that will add to this totality of critical mass of states and critical mass of public opinion that set the stage for achieving the goal through the Supreme Court. So we have a very clear roadmap of where are the points of opportunity? Which states can we win? How can we build more support? How can we increase visibility? How can we tell more stories? And anyone who goes on our website or reads the roadmap to victory, finishing the job plan we put out immediately after the Supreme Court wins this year about how we're going to get the job done, can see what are the points of opportunity that we as a movement, we as a country, can rally behind. This year it may be winning New York. Next year it may be defeating an attack in Minnesota. The following year. And each of these points of opportunity working together nationally are how we're going to advance strategically. And Freedom to Marry has laid out a set of clear targets that we want to achieve by 2016 in order to set the stage for that return to the Supreme Court. And it talks about, number one, getting a majority of Americans living in a freedom to marry state up from about a third as of our wins today.
Mm-hmm.
And by 2016, we want to have 60+% support for the freedom to marry, up from about 53 to 55% right now by 2016. Now, these are very big, ambitious, bold, hard goals, but they're attainable. And by having great clarity about what it's going to take to do these things, people can connect to the movement. People can connect to what work they can do. They can figure out where do they send their donation to make the most difference. Which phone banks do they sign up with? Which particular activist piece of work do they engage in? Instead of randomly people doing whatever, which generally means we don't hit the sweet spot of getting enough done. And on this ladder of clarity, working down from vision and then strategy and then vehicles, the final rung is to have clarity about action steps. What are we asking people to do? How can you make a difference today, whether it's by accessing tools on the website or having personal conversations with your neighbors or enlisting others to be engaged or signing up with important campaigns and organizations? How do you get involved? And I think imperfectly, what Freedom to Marry has done is bring great clarity and great focus to that whole ladder of action. And that's why we've been able to achieve this extraordinary transformation. And it's the same strategy that, if we stick with it, is going to bring us home in the next chapter. So the overriding lesson I have to offer to colleagues is have those levels of clarity in the campaign you're mapping out.
Thank you. It's very inspiring. It, of course, inspires in me many questions about ambiguity. But before I get to those, I want to turn to Tico and ask, as he hears this and studies Freedom to Marry and the whole marriage equality campaign, what he does take from that and where you see the intersections and maybe the differences.
Great. Thank you, Anne, for being here to be our moderator of this great discussion.
Sure.
And I think you are absolutely right that what Evan has accomplished and what Freedom to Marry has accomplished is incredibly inspiring, and it is in fact the inspiration for Freedom to Work. We copied not only Evan's organizational name, I've copied his haircut, and
you've got Matt McTighe from Maine now working on, who did Marriage in Maine, doing ENDA stuff now.
We've also copied many of the lessons and learned from many of the lessons that Evan has just discussed and presented to us. With respect to winning in more states, we agree that we need to increase the number of state laws, of state Employment Non-Discrimination Acts, not just for employment, for housing and public accommodation as well. So what we've done at Freedom to Work is we have launched the very first in our movement's history testing project. So we have been doing for the past 7 months, and we are continuing and expanding, a series of investigations. We're now testing and investigating 12 companies in 12 states to find out through matched pair resume studies whether they are engaging in anti-gay, anti-lesbian, anti-bi, or anti-trans workplace discrimination by calling back lesser qualified straight applicants over more qualified LGBT applicants. We've chosen our states for investigation in part through talking to our allies, talking to other movement organizations, and identifying those states which we think are going to be the next victories for state-level anti-discrimination laws. So we are testing in Pennsylvania. We are testing in Ohio. We are testing in Michigan and Missouri, West Virginia, North Carolina, Utah. We are testing in all of the next battleground states where we expect to have a strong push, maybe not in the next 6 months, but in the next few years, to have a strong push and a real chance at passing a state-level ENDA law. So what we're going to do with that data is that it is unfortunately the case that sometimes when there is a city council debate, as happened at one of the Alaska city councils a year ago, when there is a state legislature debate, some of the opponents of the law say, why is this even needed? Nobody discriminates against LGBT people in employment anymore. What proof do you have? And there have been a few times where the proponents of the bill have struggled a little bit to bring forward proof. And that's one huge value added where I think Freedom to Work is doing unparalleled work in our movement. In fact, this is sort of never been tried before, or tried in only very limited capacities. So we think we're going to be able to provide evidence over the course of the next months and years to help state-level advocates advocate for more city ordinances, more statewide legislative wins, and we're also using it for litigation. So we filed Freedom to Work versus Exxon based on this matched pair resume testing in Illinois. The inspiration for that in terms of learning from other movements is that I remember being in law school and reading the case law about African-American civil rights testers who went in to get jobs, who were qualified for those jobs and who were turned away, when their matched pair, sometimes lesser qualified white applicant got the job. And it was African-American groups and Latino groups and disability advocates who've used civil rights testing for decades now to prove discrimination, to win legal battles, to advance their civil rights movement. And that, up until very recently, has not been done by our movement. And I'm very proud that we have started and we're going to expand that work to help win more states and help win more cases. Another inspiration or another point of similarity I'd make with Evan's tremendous work is that, in my opinion, there is a need for both large general LGBT organizations that work on many issues very successfully, and there's a real need for narrow, specific, single-issue specialists and single-issue campaigns who work exclusively on one issue. Because what it means is that when ENDA isn't hot, and there are periods where there are lulls in ENDA work, the general organizations shift attention, obviously and understandably, to other issues that are hot. And I understand and support that. And as a gay person who wants to get married, I don't think I'm in competition with Evan's efforts. I think Evan's efforts benefit me tremendously, in terms of my future marriage, perhaps, and in terms of our movement. His wins build momentum for our wins and vice versa. So I think the point is, we have lacked, in terms of ENDA's advocacy, we lacked for 20 or 30 years a single issue advocate that worked only on ENDA, and that when ENDA wasn't hot, would keep the ball moving. And so I think that's a critically important role that we are starting to play. We're coming up on our 2nd birthday, and I hope not to reach our 3rd birthday. I would love to retire this organization in 2014. It'll take a sort of shooting the moon scenario and quite the Hail Mary pass to get ENDA through. I don't want to say Hail Mary. I know there are reporters here. That's too front. That's too long a shot.
And brings up the question of religious exemptions all over again.
Which we've already done. Much
We may get back to it, but let me ask Evan what you think about the parallels and the differences as you hear Tico talk. It was so clear what marriage was about, and it was so easy to get, or from my point of view anyway, maybe not from yours, to get couples to show up and tell their story and be sympathetic and all of that. And from what I've heard from Tico elsewhere, I suspect it's not quite as easy with employment cases.
Well, it's interesting you say it's so easy and then, caught yourself, because what is true, and the reason I think you said that is that marriage is so powerful. It's such a resonant vocabulary.
Yes.
It's such a resonant set of values: love, commitment, connectedness, family, inclusion, doing the work day to day of building a life, all those things. And that's right. That once we tapped into the power of that, it was a sea changer of attitudes and understanding.
And people existed in families
Exactly.
and could then spread it out in their families.
That's right, and not just gay people, but non-gay people. So we were claiming of a common vocabulary.
Yeah.
Of course, it took a lot of work to get the movement to be willing to claim that vocabulary because of people's fear of exactly how powerful it was, and therefore how much resistance it also brought to the surface. But that, to me, was always the reason to fight for the freedom to marry. Number one, because marriage and the bundle of protections it brings, tangible and intangible, are important. And number two, because by claiming this vocabulary, it would be an engine of change and understanding. So in that sense, you're right. With marriage, once we claimed it, it was powerful and easy to see the effects, and the effects are tremendous. In 17 years, we've gone from 27% of the American people supporting the freedom to marry to now literally more than doubling at 55%.
Shocking.
That's almost an unprecedented rate of change on something that just 10 minutes ago people were saying was so hard and difficult we shouldn't touch it.
But here you have 80-90% think it's fine and is already done.
Right. So 2 points on that. Just to finish the other point first, the part that wasn't easy was knowing how best to tell our stories and making sure we really did it. Getting us as lesbian, as gay, as bisexual, as transgender, and as people who love us to tell our stories, to do that work of telling our stories, to break that silence, that's been a tremendous lift. We're so used to not doing that. We're so used to taking people either for granted or assuming we can't get them, that it's been tremendous work, and it remains tremendous work. It's one of the major projects of Freedom to Marry, is to get people to have the conversations and tell their stories. And the other thing that I think Freedom to Marry has put a lot of attention into and been successful in over the last few years is figuring out what's the best way that diverse messengers and diverse stories can be heard. So for many of the years in which we were fighting this, we tended to make a variety of arguments and tell a variety of stories, and skewed toward an emphasis on justice, on rights, on the Constitution, on the law, on the
benefits,
on the legal protections and responsibilities that flow from it, all of which are very true and very powerful and brought us to a near majority, but it didn't get us a majority. And so beginning about 5 or 6 years ago, Freedom to Marry, led by Thalia Zapata as one of our team members, really dug into what were we doing right and what needed we to do better. And to make a long story short, we worked very hard to shift the emphasis, not come up with a soundbite or something, but to shift the emphasis so we weren't getting in our own way, and instead to prioritize telling our stories in a language of values, in a language of emotion, in a language of connection, of personal and local and authentic real stories. And that brought us to this majority we have now. So now, shifting over to employment, not the terrain I'm most familiar with, all the nuts and bolts, but I don't think there's been the same comparable, assiduous, sustained focus on generating those stories and figuring out how best to tell them. And that's what Freedom to Work's stepping up to do this. That's what Americans for Workplace Opportunity, another campaign that Tico is working alongside, have stepped up to do. And I think that is another lesson from the Freedom to Marry movement, that you need a campaign to give people the tools, the language, the encouragement, the impetus, the urgency of telling those stories and marshaling what in this case is a comparative advantage. A majority of Americans are with us. We don't so much have to persuade them, we have to mobilize them and then turn that energy to Congress.
And perhaps educate them to, not to the rights and benefits, but to the fact that this doesn't exist.
Exactly.
And Tico?
I agree entirely with Evan's analysis. I do want to identify one hurdle that we as ENDA advocates have that by and large freedom to marry advocates do not have, and that is confidentiality agreements. Many of our most compelling stories of workplace discrimination, many of the most disgusting examples of workplace discrimination end in a confidentiality agreement because the employer, sometimes a very good employer who just had a bad apple manager at one satellite office who allowed horrible racist or anti-gay or anti-trans discrimination, does the responsible thing, maybe fires the harassing employee and settles with the victim. But to protect their reputation, they settle in a confidentiality agreement. To give you one example, Freedom to Work, in addition to doing lobbying, is a legal services provider. And we have, for the last 2.5 years, represented an African-American transgender woman who was the victim of very severe workplace harassment because she is trans. She was verbally harassed at work. She was physically harassed at work. And I very much wish that the American people could have met her on 60 Minutes or on CNN or on Fox News. I think they would have been moved. I think they would have been disgusted by what happened. And I think they would have been moved by a pitch she could have made for the importance of ENDA. The thing is, the case settled with the confidentiality agreement. It was the only way that case could settle. And like her, there are many, many, many examples of people who initially think that they would love to be ENDA advocates and end up not being able to. So that is one liability, but I do not mean it as an excuse. There is an incredible
it's you've identified it as a real question, and it makes me immediately ask, well, should people stop signing confidentiality agreements? Should there be a campaign with employers to get them to stop asking for confidentiality agreements? What do you think?
Well, let me just throw out, though, that, and I know you're not using it as an excuse because you gave an example a moment earlier of something creative that you're doing to find another source of stories, which is the testing program.
Yeah.
And Dave Montez from GLAAD in the prior panel told the story, was it Martin Brown?
Yes.
So, I mean, look, there's a set of stories where you may have that problem, but there are a lot of stories out there. There are a lot of people, including business leaders and others, who can talk about the values of non-discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a mix of those things that we need to be putting forward. I wouldn't disparage the complication over here, but then you go over here and you find your ways of doing it. And I think the great news is, and the reason I accepted the invitation to come share this stage with Freedom to Work is because there's now a campaign over here to try to generate and mobilize those stories and create the climate. And you alluded to another campaign working alongside the AWO, the Americans for Workplace Opportunity, led by, as you said, Matt McTighe, a member of the Freedom to Marry family who led our campaign in Maine, and Amy Mello, who's doing the field organizing and so on, also working with Freedom to Marry. So these guys know the lessons and what works and the importance of storytelling and the importance of focus. And I'm really confident that with this effort here and this effort here and the rest of us pitching in where we can be helpful, we can do this because, unlike with marriage, we don't have to reframe people's whole understanding. We do not have to break through a giant barrier of resistance. We have to marshal what's there and apply it to the points of opportunity. It's a different set of challenges, not easy, but still, but very doable.
Now, one of the biggest barriers in marriage was the religious question. The resistance was about, marriage is a religious institution, and this violates it, and this is against the Bible, and this is perverse and sinful and disgusting, and how dare you come invade our religious institution, given, of course, that we were asking for civil marriage. But that was, so technically that hasn't been the problem with ENDA, but now there is this this religious freedom question coming up. The New York Times, by the way, just to throw this in parenthetically, said that the religious exemption you've written into this ENDA is too broad, as did the LA Times, as do these other groups. And I'm a little confused by your explanation earlier, because to me, my understanding of what has been written into ENDA is that, say, a Catholic hospital, which gets a lot of federal funds, would be entitled to fire a billing clerk who is gay simply because they didn't like hiring a gay person, even though they are a federally funded and probably state funded too institution. So we're not talking about just houses of worship. When we're talking about nonprofits that are religiously affiliated, we're talking about organizations that get a lot of public funding and would and have no BFOQ in the Civil Rights Act, a bona fide occupational qualification here. So I'd like both of you to talk a little about the religious challenges and solutions and all of that. I've thrown this out as an incoherent question.
Let me just say something before
Sure.
Tico takes on the religious exemption language and ENDA question.
Yeah.
But on the broad...
And I will also say I'm taken by Melissa's reaction, which is, oh, just pass the damn thing. That'll all be thrown out in the courts anyway.
Yeah. I don't think that was exactly correct. It was,
you never know.
Melissa had other good answers.
You never
that
know.
was not one of them. But before you get to exemption stuff, let me just talk a moment about religion. I mean, religion... One of our job in the Freedom to Marry work, which continues and we're not done, number one was to help people understand that this is not about telling religions what to do. This is about the government, the law, and civil marriage, and people can understand that and respect that.
Eventually.
Well, you have to go out and talk. You can't just assume people are going to get there. You have to do the work, and that remains true for us. But people can understand that the government should never be telling a priest whom the priest must marry, but nor should the cardinal be calling down to the clerk's office and saying, don't give that divorced Catholic couple a marriage license, because we wouldn't marry them.
Right.
And people can understand that. But the other, I think, in some ways, even more important piece of work we've done with great success so far, and I need to keep going, is going past the mere invocation of religion as a reason to shut down the conversation and engaging in values, not doctrine, not religion, because we're not trying to tell religions what to do. But most people are motivated by values of the golden rule, treat others as you would want to be treated, respecting love, respecting commitment, respecting the separation of church and state. And so to engage in that conversation, not let religion be sort of an on-off switch, is what brought us the share that brought us to a majority. And I think likewise here we can talk about values and fairness and empathy and wanting to be treated the way you'd want to be treated. Now, the separate question you then folded into that is the language within the proposed bill that would carve out coverage by certain kinds of entities for LGBT people. And I do have grave concerns about the specific language in the specific bill, and that's one of the points of difference I have with Freedom to Work on this current bill.
Well,
Tico.
I'm glad you asked the question. It is one that we get asked when we lobby on Capitol Hill in every single meeting. It is, this is an interesting sort of statement on where we are as a movement and where we are as ENDA advocates. When we meet with Republican offices, we spend a whole lot more time answering their questions about the religious exemption than we do talking about transgender people. I think many of the Republicans are just sort of non-pulse. They're over it. They are indifferent as to whether trans as well as LGB people are in the bill. I would say that in a bunch of Republican meetings, we spend a majority of the time talking about the religious exemption and exactly how it will apply, what the case law is. I reread those Third Circuit, Ninth Circuit, et cetera, cases on the Title VII religious exemption on a weekly basis, because I've got to be ready to sort of recite the facts and recite the holdings to members of Congress who want to learn about these issues. You added a very important and I think critical distinction in the way you phrased the question, Ann. You introduced the issue of federal funding.
Yes.
And I think that changes it. And this is where I think I can now be back on Evan's side. When an entity takes federal funds whether as a grantee, whether as a contractor performing the work of the federal government, I believe we must have clear rules that ban LGBT discrimination. And this takes us to one of the only unfulfilled campaign promises that our current president made to the LGBT community. He promised in writing 5 years ago that when he was a candidate running against Hillary Clinton and courting our votes and courting our dollars, he promised in writing that he would sign an executive order banning federal contractors from discriminating against LGBT people. He hasn't done it. The excuses made by White House staff have been laughable. They have been embarrassing. And the president hasn't spoken to the issue himself in public in the past 5 years. So that's a campaign where I think there's complete uniformity of position and effort. We've been working alongside the ACLU, alongside HRC, alongside the Williams Institute and CAP, and I think there's complete uniformity that we are all pushing for a federal policy that if you take and profit from federal dollars, you must follow American values, you must pledge not to discriminate against LGBT folks, and if you get caught, there should be consequences. And that could mean an investigation by the Department of Labor, and that could mean a finding that you discriminated and broke that executive order that has protected African Americans and Latinos and women, the disabled and veterans for decades now, without any real problem for corporate America, without any problem for contractors. It has been an important part of our civil rights apparatus for keeping people safe from discrimination. And we're going to keep, speaking of parallel campaigns, at the same time that we push for ENDA, there is no valid reason to give the president a pass and say that he doesn't have to sign the executive order that he promised in writing 5 years ago to sign.
Yeah,
You're itching to say
No,
something.
I want to go back to the exemption language within the current draft of ENDA and go to an answer that Melissa Sklarz gave on the prior panel that I think was a great answer. And Brad Sears made the point as well, which is that these are not new questions. How to balance the imperative of opportunity in the workplace with due protection for religious freedom is not a new something we have to invent now. We have a body of law, and we have a body of laws across the country that includes sexual orientation and gender identity as prohibited discriminatory classifications alongside race and sex and others. And they have all followed generally a certain kind of exemption, as has Title VII and the Civil Rights Act and so on. The problem with this current draft of ENDA is that exemption goes far beyond now. What that body of experience has taught us is the right balance. And that's the specific challenge there. And I would say that the political answer and the political argument is in the same way that I know Freedom to Work and the others who talked on the first panel are saying to members of Congress, you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Look at what's happening in 17 states and 25 states, et cetera. That ought to be the same answer we give when it comes to trying to carve out new and unnecessary and dangerous exemptions from non-discrimination law. And by the way, calling them religious exemptions implies that there's some religious problem to be solved. There is no religious problem to be solved. What these are licenses to discriminate.
Well, and isn't the answer, and Tico, I'm not cutting you off here, I'll get you in, isn't the answer what you were suggesting about a values conversation? That instead of saying to Republican legislators, don't worry, all these religious people will have full freedom to reject anyone they want. Heaven forbid they should have to hire people. Do you instead say to them, look, I understand your question, but aren't we talking about American values here? They're running an organization where they hire people, whether they get public funding or not. They are a public accommodation, or they are an organization that does get public funding, whatever. They should be treating people fairly, and they should not have the right to fire people for no good reason.
As a Catholic, I want my church to change.
Sure.
I want it to treat me with respect. I want it to recognize me as a child of God. I want it to treat me in the same way that the Catholic Church treats my brother. And I think that is a battle that we as Catholics can wage, and we can push our church. We can vote with our feet and go to a different church. We can...
get arrested in St. Patrick's Cathedral. Sorry, I'm on to me.
That was before my time.
No doubt.
But I don't think the law should be used to force. I don't believe the civil rights statute in the form of Title VII and ENDA should be used to force the Catholic Church to make a change to its policies. I think we will push them, and it may take decades, it may take more than my lifetime. We will push them in other ways.
Well,
and I do want to talk about the specific language, because the thing that I found confusing about Evan's analysis is he sort of said, don't reinvent the wheel. And as one of two attorneys who wrote the current exemption, I guess I have to say that by using the verb wrote, I'm sort of exaggerating, because I literally copied and pasted it from Title VII. It's a copy and paste job. It is, it is in terms of the scope of the universe of entities that qualify or do not qualify, we copied and pasted the Title VII language. And my final point on this is, I'm glad we're having the debate. I respect tremendously the intelligence and the values, not only of Evan on this side of the debate, but of every single one of the organizations in our movement that signed that letter. I would love for them to publicly release their alternative, so we can debate it that way. I've got, the work product I'm defending is not only public, it's been voted on and supported by Tammy Baldwin, by Nancy Pelosi, by John Conyers, by Javier Becerra, by George Miller, by all of our progressive champions. They saw the language, they voted for it, and they affirmed it. They thought it was the right call. So I would love to continue the debate in an even more useful way. I would love for those organizations to publicly communicate to the LGBT community and to Congress what is their proposal. Because here's the really interesting thing. They made a big fuss in that letter, and then they didn't seek an amendment at markup. They didn't ask any of our progressive champions, and there are very progressive champions on that committee, or if they asked, then they got rejected. I don't know which is the truth, which actually happened. But let's put out the alternative and let's debate it. Let's put it up for a vote on the floor of the Senate.
Okay, so I want to push back a teeny bit, but then I also want to make a point that I think you'll like better. So the pushback is when you did the discussion of not forcing the Catholic Church and you as a Catholic and so on, all of that is completely irrelevant to the conversation about what statutory license to discriminate should be put in a bill with regard to workplace. Nobody is saying that the Catholic Church should be sued or told what to do as a matter of law when it comes to doctrine or the church or ministers or priests and so on. So I think that's misleading language that might confuse people in a way that you didn't intend. The other point I would say, and you're certainly much more of an expert than I am, is that while I believe it is true that the exemption may track the Title VII Civil Rights Act language with regard to who's covered, it doesn't track title rights balance with regard to what those covered entities are free to do in firing or discriminating against an employee. That's the exemption. That's problematic.
I will make a concession to Evan. He is correct on that point. But the ACLU's alternative, which is not public, but which I have, commits the same sin.
Okay, well, I'm not here speaking as an expert on ENDA or on behalf of the ACLU or trying to complicate matters or so on, but I do believe that the Title VII balance, which is the balance struck in most, if not all, of the state laws that exist already, which says that a certain category of entities are completely exempt, true religious entities, churches and so on. No one's trying to tell them whom they must hire, what they must do.
And true religious jobs.
And true religious, yeah, that's
Yeah.
the second, thank you. That's the second point. But to say that just because something has some degree of religion in it, but now it's in the marketplace, it can now fire the janitor, not just a priest, but the janitor, that's an exemption that doesn't exist in Title VII or in the other parts of the law. Having said all of this, and I know this is not even where you wanted to put the emphasis, of course, it's just one of the challenges in navigating the legislative and political process. But here's the point I think you'll like, which is that in part it's right to get this religious exemption right amongst the advocate side, because what the anti-gay side wants to do is distract and divert. And the real conversation we all should be having with Americans is where you were and where you were, which is to be talking about the real impact of discrimination on real people, the real stories, the values of fairness and respect, and that's where we win. That's where we have, what is it, 80% support.
Yes.
The religious exemption language thing is mostly a distraction. It's a non and wrong solution to a non-problem.
But it
that's been
does,
thrown in
yeah.
there, but it becomes important if it
Yes.
gets put into law. And
Yeah,
that's why it's
look,
important.
I feel a little guilty even raising it because of that distractive potential. It is now, by my watch, about 4:03. Are we at a hard cutoff point?
We are within minutes of hard cutoff, so I want to conclude by thanking both of you for this really important conversation, for the lessons learned, and I think they are numerous. We could have gone for another hour on
At
lessons
least,
learned
yeah.
from Evan's tremendous advocacy over the course of many years to bring us to the point where 2013 is in many ways the year of freedom to marry. It is a year where we have made historic, incredible advances for LGBT people and our freedom to marry. And I think it is also a year when we can make some advances for the freedom to work. And so we're thrilled that over the course of the next few months, there will be a full-throated, full momentum Senate campaign to win not just 60 votes, but to run up the score. And as part of that campaign, we at Freedom to Work want to invite you back. So this very first convening of the ENDA Situation Room, I think, was tremendously successful. I'm grateful to our hosts at New York Law School, to our virtual hosts at Towleroad, and to all of you who watched and who can tweet with us and blog with us afterward. But this is just the beginning of a lot of work that's going to happen over the fall. And I'm happy to announce that Freedom to Work's second ENDA Situation Room will happen in Miami, Florida. It will be an all Spanish language event. We'll be inviting leaders from national Latino groups like National Council of La Raza, like the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, like the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, as well as those of us who are Latino and gay and who work at LGBT organizations. So I'm hoping that GLAAD, with its unparalleled outreach ability to Spanish language media, will come back and accept our invitation to be at the second Situation Room. And, you know, it is right to speak to the Latino community because, you know, some of us are gay and Latino, and ENDA affects us, but it is also strategically very important in the next 3 months, because as we identified on panel 1 in the Situation Room, of the key states where we are in full campaign mode, those include Florida, that includes Arizona, and that includes Nevada, states with incredibly large Latino voting populations. And our campaign wants to speak to those voters, to speak to not just LGBT Latinos, but to our mothers and fathers, our abuelos, our abuelas, who are on our side and who are allies in this fight, and ask them to call Congress, to write to Congress, to ask those next gettable senators to stand on the right side of history, to stand with all of us in favor of American freedom to work for all people, no matter who you are or who you love. So thanks to everyone who tuned in, thanks to everyone who participated. We will see you in Miami very soon. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.